Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to be going over the best dual purpose champions for the current victory track meta in order to help you advance to Gladiator Circuit. So these champions typically will have equally potent uses offensively and defensively. These are champions that you often do want to have specific counters for, or they can be very troublesome to deal with. But in addition to that, they are also capable of finishing fights extremely quickly with like sub 1 minute times, and they're often some of the most versatile champions in the game. And this is specifically meant for the victory track meta that we have currently. But also, since victory track meta nodes are kind of irrelevant, this is also a fairly good template in general, which champions are the best dual-purpose champions at the moment for Battlegrounds overall. Right, so let's get to it, and let's start off with a champion that is, I see it, I ban it because I don't have one. That's simple as that. Galen is crazy powerful offensively. He can finish many fights with like a single level 1 or a single level 2, and on top of it, he's also very annoying to fight against. He has some unique immunities for a cosmic champion, and obviously unless you are able to basically prevent him from activating special attacks or gaining buffs, it's gonna be very hard to deal with the guy, and you're gonna be taking bursts of damage. So definitely a very troublesome champion to deal with. And then we have Hercules, and the situation with Hercules is not exactly the same with Galen, because Hercules obviously is extremely fast offensive option that can answer some of the tougher matchups. You do need to be very comfortable with intercepting, because effective use of Hercules depends on how quickly you can ramp him up, and that often involves like 4 or 5 dash back, 1 hit intercepts at the beginning of the fight and things like that. At the same time, Hercules realistically is not a hard champion to fight against. He is not a dangerous champion to fight against, but he is a champion that will make opponent waste their time. First thing that is extremely underrated about Hercules on defense is his Infuriate, where he reduces opponents' offensive ability accuracy by 60%. That means when you strike Hercules and you have this Infuriate active, quite often your abilities will be failing, and that is going to slow down the match. And then obviously he has very lengthy special attack animations, and on top of it all, he has his immortality that he pauses during special attacks basically, and it just can take forever to defeat him, which is often more than enough to sneak past your opponents to the victory. And another champion that is more similar to Galen is Hulkling, because Hulkling obviously does have counters like virtually any champion Battlegrounds, and Hulkling can be absolutely shredded and destroyed if opponent has something like Hood or Longshot or a handful of other Mystic champions. At the same time, there aren't that many counters, and the cool thing about drafting Hulkling always is the fact that, yes, since he's such an effective dual-purpose threat, not only will opponent be forced to look for a solution against Hulkling, but also they will have to worry about him as an attacker, because he's arguably one of the most effective Penny Parker killers, and on top of it, even in like a generic matchup, he always does well because he has high damage output with very simple rotation of get to level 2 and ideally, you know, drop it in opponent's block, gain 2 Furies, and you nuke champions down. So that is basically a definition of a dangerous dual-purpose champion in Hulkling. Cannot underestimate how useful he is. Then we have Scorpion, champion that I acquired recently, and I unfortunately myself never really got the chance to use him on a victory track. But I had to face this guy all the time. He's a champion that is finicky to work around due to his evade, so ideally going up against Scorpion you will want an evade counter. On top of it, it's a lot of people still kind of often forget what immunities he has. The fact that he's immune to Rapture, or the fact that he is immune to Shock as well, can kind of catch people off surprise. And then obviously offensively, he's also capable of finishing fights extremely quickly against many of the more annoying Mystic champions. So definitely, again, fits in the category of the best dual-purpose champions. And we have Immortal Abomination. And the trick with Immortal Abomination is slightly different than it is with the champions so far previously, because realistically, if you have a good counter against Immortal Abomination, he isn't that hard to fight against. He's fairly straightforward. There's no weight, there's no unstoppable, there's nothing really stopping you from nuking this guy down, aside from the fact that he's going to be placing poisons on you. And he's one of those champions you kind of trap or catch your opponent off guard with, and it is always very satisfying feeling in a sense. And then obviously as a science poison reliant champion with access to petrify and unblockable and tons of poison damage and weakness and many debuffs in general, he is just also effective offensively. Yeah, a very solid kind of like a staple battleground champion for many. And similar situation here is with SpiderHam, obviously, with the fact that he does damage while powers things, lets him bypass a lot of annoying abilities and nodes. And then defensively, he can also be extremely troublesome to deal with, especially if your opponent times placing this guy well, because he doesn't really allow you to use champions that require to go up to level 2, for instance, in order to do damage. And if you want to fight SpiderHam effectively on defense, you need champions that are perfectly comfortable spamming their level 1s and or completely bypassing evade. But even then, with all the taunts and his damage mitigation from special attacks, and then if he dashes back, he can catch you with that evade and unblockable. So there's definitely quite a lot to be worried about with the Piggy. Kingpin overall is, I think, pretty much one of the best battleground champion. He works virtually in like every meta, and he's just crazy good. He's surprisingly hard to deal with on defense due to his increased combat power rate and ability to shrug off debuffs. The fact that you pretty much never want him to shoot off his level 2 stalls the fights out extremely efficiently, because yeah, if he gets to level 2, it's harder to evade, it can do a ton of damage, and then obviously you have to wait out the unstoppable, so you want to bait out the level 1, but he gains more power, so he consistently has that level 1 that you need to bait out. And then obviously offensively, his level 1 negates and bypasses a ton of abilities and nodes, even like this week's Gladiator Circuit node, and he is just extremely versatile option offensively as well. One of the best kind of like opening draft picks, in my opinion, that you can possibly get. And similar situations with Moleman to a lesser degree. I do think that Moleman is also extremely troublesome to deal with on defense, unless you have like a very specific counter. Typically that will involve like a mutant champion, because again, it's tricky to parry him, and Moleman has that additional annoyance on the fact that you can't hit his block and the AI often cramps up, and then you just end up wasting a lot of time in the fights. And obviously on attack, he can just nuke down champions. Now, again, no lie, he was better before Kabam bug fixed him, or whatever you want to say about that, when he could also work as a really, really effective and quick evade counter. But still, even now, I think he's well worth a spot in your deck. Now, Nick Fury, again, is primarily a defensive champion for many, but if you do max out deep wounds, he can actually completely divert opponents and be used offensively. And I have kind of like tricked opponents with that as well, where draft Nick Fury, opponent gets an Archangel to counter it. I draft more defenders that Archangel can't do anything about it, and then just use Nick Fury to nuke down like a science champion or something. With deep wounds, even in first life, he actually is surprisingly quick as an attacker and can catch many people off guard, but definitely as a defender as well, worth having in your deck. And then we have Guardian. Guardian also is kind of like a definition of a dual-purpose champion because of his huge energy resistance, bleed resistance, increased block proficiency, and critical damage resistance. He is quite tanky for as long as opponents can't get rid of his armor buff. And currently on victory track, he also benefits from the fact that True Strike, True Accuracy, and whatever other True Sense abilities do not work and cannot prevent his auto block. And then obviously there is the auto block where you virtually never feel safe throwing special attacks against this guy because he's just going to be auto blocking all of them. And then offensively, he, depending on his rank and the opponent that you go up against, one level 1 and then a level 2, or 2 level 1s and a level 2 typically is enough to completely nuke down the opponent. He's not the fastest attacker, but he's again extremely versatile in terms of what champions he can deal with. Moving on is Penny Parker. And most people would expect Penny Parker to be included in like must-have defenders list, and she is a great defender without a doubt. But realistically, her value as a defender is slightly declining in vast majority of the metas, because we do have Gallons, we do have Hulklings now, more and more people are learning how to deal with Penny Parker using Massacre, using Tigra, using a whole bunch of different champions. Silver Surfer is still one of the most effective counters to her. I actually have a full-on video how to deal with Penny Parker on Bulwark node, but, you know, same principles typically apply. But at the same time, she is a perfect champion in a sense where whenever you draft her, you will force opponent to seek for a counter against her. And then you can just turn the table and take this champion and use it offensively and nuke down opponents. Immortal Abomination, for instance, utilizing her poison immunity. And it's important that you remember that she is poison and incinerate immune as well. And obviously, she offensively works very similar to Guardian, where one level 1 and a level 2 or 2 level 1s and a level 2 is enough to nuke down your opponent. Then we have Dr. Doom. Never underestimate the Doom. This dude has beaten me so many times. He's just one of those guys where you need a good counter to this guy. And even with a decently good counter, the fights can go wrong quickly because of the amount of chip damage that you can take. That puts you at disadvantage. Then if you miss away the level 2 because you didn't want him to use a level 1 and start nullifying left, right, and center, he's just a pain to deal with. And then obviously his armor, his crit resistance, you need a good counter. And then, again, he's one of those champions where you can turn around and use him offensively. He's not the fastest attacker either. There are faster mystics in the game. But at the same time, you can rely on him to take down like a Korg with no noticeable damage in like 60 seconds in general. So there are definitely a ton of uses for this guy offensively and defensively, and he's one of those champions that always puts opponents on notice very quickly and easily. Next up, one of my personal favorites, especially for victory track, and it's Rinter. And the cool thing about Rinter is that he has one of the top 5 biggest health pools in the game, and additional energy and critical resistance. And with that, he's tanky. And typically, even if opponents have a great matchup, a great counter, as long as so do you against whatever you're going up against, you will often be faster than your opponents. Obviously, he requires specific counters as well. Nobody that gains buffs freely is going to do well against him. And also the fact that he has to be heavied all the time often hinders a ton of champion rotations and they cannot play quite freely. And with all of those things combined, there is no sweeter feeling where you draft a Rinter, you force opponent to get a counter, and then you turn around and nuke down opponent's Hulkling, Omega Sentinel, or just any other random champion, because he is extremely powerful offensive force as well, where if you get lucky and he crits on level 2, you can finish the entire fight with a single level 2 in like 20-some seconds. If you don't get lucky, you're going to need 2 level 2s, and then he's probably going to take like 40-some seconds if you use him in appropriate matchup. So he's definitely a force to be reckoned with, and one of my favorite recent rank ups personally. Use him a ton, see him banned a ton. And then we have Domino. Domino, again, offensively, she can be hit and miss. Offensively, I have had some really satisfying fights with her where you drop a level 2 and opponent just melts. And then I have had very frustrating fights where you drop 3 level 2s and not a single bleed and basically nothing crits and the opponent's still alive and you lose a matchup that you for sure think that you won. So it is a risky affair to use Domino offensively, but the real, again, terror of Domino lies in the fact that there are very few counters to a high sig Domino that are going to get that out of that fight unscathed. Especially on the victory track nodes, now that she gains more, potent abilities. When she evades, she places disorient on opponents, and that makes them harder parry, and that fight can turn into a nightmare. If your Domino is relatively high sig, there are like 4 or 5 opponents in the game that can come out with, relatively unscathed health. Yes, obviously the fact that Omega Sentinel and Nimrod exists and Guardian exists, it's something that you need to play around with. But again, that's a very easy way how you absolutely force opponents to get one of those champions, and then you can just turn around and use Domino offensively if need be. And my personal kind of opinion, obviously, and value of Domino has shifted quite drastically, and to a point where I did take her from like SIG 20 to SIG 160, I believe, because it is very much so worth having a relatively high SIG Domino as a constant threat to your opponents. Then we have Toad. Situation with Toad is fairly similar to Immortal Abomination. Toad in itself is not particularly hard to fight against. He's harder to go up against than Immortal Abomination, especially because of his region. And there are several tricks that you need to know if you want to defeat Toads effectively. Number one, that would be do not let him go in corners. Basically, you need to pay attention where the fight's taking place. And then obviously also be aware of the fact that when you crit against Toad, you have significantly higher chance to get poisoned. So crit heavy champions will get poisoned like crazy, or use poison immunity. But if you use poison immunity, there's also the problem of potentially getting stunned. So Toad is definitely a defensive menace. In a sense, he has the same weakness as Domino, where you opponent, if they get Nimrod or Meg Sentinel, then Toad's gonna be toast. But he does have that cool party trick where he's very good against a ton of skilled champions. Offensively, he's good against champions like Moleman, like Kingpin, and especially Nick Fury, with often being able to pretty much bypass his second life. So he definitely has offensive capabilities as well, and he is quite a reliable champion to have for Battlegrounds. Next up is Bishop. Bishop is no joke now, obviously after his buff. Whenever AI does whatever AI wants to do, and if he throws a level 1 randomly, then you will worry about that Incinerate immunity. If you push him to level 2, then you need to be very adapted to waiting his level 2, because that can hit a ton through block or be unblockable. And then obviously offensively, he's one of the best champions to dispatch from Korgs and Kingpins and a whole bunch of other skilled champions. So he holds quite a lot of value, in my opinion. Is also a staple Battlegrounds champion. Obviously, there are a lot more champions, but these were like largely the champions that I am kind of accustomed to relying on, or at least vast majority of the champions that I went over in today's video are in my own deck. And there are obviously other champions that can be brought into your deck and serve you extremely well. But I hope that these videos have been somewhat helpful to you guys. And I'm going to catch you later. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about